Okay, we don't have to stand on ceremony here. I think it's roughly 10 after. Just to review the bidding, there are some students in the class with disability accommodations, DSP accommodations, and yesterday I emailed you information about how your accommodations get worked out. A couple of you have responded to me that you got that information. The others haven't. Please do, so I know you got it. All right. But I sent it to your Berkeley email address. So if that's not an email address you check routinely, check there. All right. So this exam covers everything to date, lectures and assigned readings. The exam is a little bit shorter than previous exams in terms of questions. It's only 14 questions. And it's a 50-point exam, so each question is worth somewhere between 1 and 4 points, depends on the question. And it covers everything, the introduction, the lectures and readings on introspection, the mind-body problem, attention and automaticity, and this most recent material on explicit and implicit cognition, emotion, and motivation. Lots of resources for the exam. We've talked about this before. We're doing this now. All the lecture illustrations and the lecture supplements have all been updated. All past exams in the class are available. There's what I call a narrative review, basically a verbal summary of the things I think are important. All of that's there. And in addition, there's a special forum, not on B-Space, but on B-Courses, for you to post your questions. It's very clear some of you have done that already. Okay, as always in my exams, the focus is on basic concepts and principles. I'm not going to ask you about the nitty-gritty of particular experiments or anything like that. The experiments are there to illustrate general concepts and principles. So if I should ask you about a particular experiment, either you should be able to recognize it because it's really famous, or you should be able to figure out what's going on in it from knowledge of basic concepts and principles. What I propose to do is basically go through the lectures and readings. We'll do it relatively systematically to see if there are any questions. And if we get to the end before the 50 minutes is over, we'll just start over at the beginning. Okay, so there are some basic things about from the introductory lecture. We talked about how consciousness comes in two aspects, phenomenal awareness and voluntary control. We talked some about the history of the study of consciousness and what happened with behaviorism and the cognitive revolution. And then we talked about Owen Flanagan's ideas about how, despite the triumphs of the cognitive revolution, psychologists are still shy. Some psychologists are still shy about consciousness and tend not to talk about it too much. Any questions there? Going once? Okay, and then just to kind of get you into the Revan Swole book, I asked you to read the introductions to his 4 major sections, which basically constitute what would be an introductory chapter in any other textbook. His definitions of consciousness, the relationship between consciousness and natural science, how it is we can have or try to have an objective scientific understanding of subjective and private mental states, some aspects of the mind-body problem, especially the problem of establishing neural correlates of consciousness. That's all basically introductory vocabulary material, I think. Okay. There was nothing there? All right. Now we talk about introspection, and we talked about what we find when we look into our own consciousness and what we can discover about consciousness, not simply by asking questions of ourselves in a particular way. So if we ask what consciousness is full of, the answer is consciousness is full of mental states. When you ask what mental states are, the best answer still comes from Immanuel Kant, that there are basically three different kinds of mental states: states of knowing, cognitive states; states of feeling, emotional states; and states of desire, motivational states. Then we looked at what is certainly the most famous introspective analysis of consciousness, William James's, in which he identified 5 different characters or 5 different aspects of consciousness. This is something that is, as I say, probably the best analysis, introspective analysis of consciousness money can buy. Philosophers tend to put a somewhat different cast on things, talking about the analysis of consciousness into qualia, qualitative states, intentionality, qualitative states that are about something other than themselves, and the essential subjectivity of consciousness. And then we talked about how, beginning in the 19th century, psychologists tried to get away from introspection and try to link introspection to things that can be publicly observed, objectively confirmed, like the establishment of psychophysical laws that relate the physical properties of stimuli to the psychological properties of the experiences to which those stimuli give rise. And later in the 19th century, the attempt by so-called structuralists to establish what the basic qualia are for various sensory modalities: sensation, vision, audition, gustation, olfaction, and so on. And we talked a little bit about how you'd know that you'd found a quale, the singular of qualia, when you find it, especially I think James Cutting's ideas about the various kinds of features that basic qualia should have. So that was those lectures. Yes?
Regarding the psychophysical law, can you describe Weber's law?
Well, Weber's law basically says that the amount of stimulus energy that has to be added to a stimulus, the amount of energy that has to be added to a stimulus to produce a just noticeable change in the intensity of that stimulus is a constant. Okay? So to take what I think is the example in lecture, if you've got a stimulus of 100 units, never mind what the units are, and a Weber fraction of 1/10, okay, then it takes 110 units of intensity to produce a just noticeable change. So again, it's just an example of what the psychophysicists were always interested in, which is trying to tie, in this case, changes in conscious mental states to changes in stimulus intensity, something that could be publicly observed. And Fechner's law is basically just a restatement of the Weber's law, and Stevens' law is a more generalized statement. So they're all in the same mode of trying to establish the correspondence between something subjective, like the intensity of a sensory experience, to something objective, like the amount of stimulus energy in a stimulus. That's what all the psychophysical laws are about. Anything else here? All right. Well, there isn't a perfect correspondence between my lectures and Revensuo. Again, he didn't write the book I'd write, and I wouldn't write the book he wrote. But Revensuo covers much the same that kind of territory in his chapter 1, and it's oriented around a number of distinctions that are important in psychology and cognitive science. He begins with this essential distinction in the study of consciousness, or what many people think is an essential distinction, between dualism, the idea that there are two sorts of things, mental things and physical things, and then objections to that in the form of various kinds of monism, various kinds of dualism, especially interactive dualism, reductionism, eliminative materialism, all that kind of stuff, are basically ways that philosophers mostly have tried to talk about this essential philosophical problem of the relationship between the body and mind, all of which comes down to what the philosopher Joseph Levine calls the explanatory gap. That it seems very difficult to explain how exactly brain processes give rise to the conscious mental states, or as David Chalmers calls it, the hard problem of consciousness, which is first, how does it happen? How do brain processes give rise to conscious mental states? And the second version of that really is, why does it happen? Or as Chalmers puts it, why doesn't it all just go on in the dark? Okay? So, what's here? Yes? Yeah, this is Thomas Huxley's idea about epiphenomenalism. And if you ever seen a locomotive, okay, trains don't do this anymore, but if you go to the little steam engine railroad up in Tilden Park, for example, it's a steam engine that drives the gears of a locomotive, but that same steam is used to play a whistle to get people off the tracks or signal that you're coming to a station or whatever. And Huxley's analogy, that was the famous analogy, was an attempt to say, look, the steam whistle has nothing to do with what doesn't make the locomotive go, okay? It just is a byproduct of the fact that there is a fire and coal and wood and water generating steam, but it has nothing to do with what the locomotive is actually doing. And Huxley's idea was that the consciousness of brutes, as he puts it, is like that. It's just the steam that comes off something. You boil a pot of water and there's steam that comes up, but it's got nothing to do with the water anymore. It's not the steam that cooks. It's the food. It's the hot water that cooks the food, and so on. Note, however, that Huxley talked about the consciousness of brutes, which suggests that there's consciousness of non-brutes that doesn't operate that way. And since non-brutes means human beings, even Huxley wasn't prepared to call human consciousness epiphenomenal, though he did suggest that maybe ours was too. And if Huxley didn't, certainly other philosophers and psychologists and cognitive scientists have suggested that consciousness really has nothing to do with how the system works. Dan Dennett is a really good example of that, I think. And I'm not alone in thinking that. And there are others who say, well, look, you got a machine, and it operates on certain physical principles, and that's all there is to the operation of the machine. The fact that it maybe generates these weird little experiential states doesn't have anything to do with how the machine performs its functions. That's another version of epiphenomenalism. Okay. So it's hard to deny that you have consciousness. Okay, that's really a difficult thing to do. Okay, but it's not so hard if you're a philosopher of a particular kind to deny that consciousness doesn't do anything. Okay, and if you're a believer in what Professor Searle calls strong AI, that intelligence is simply a matter of performing certain computational functions on certain inputs to generate certain kinds of outputs. Consciousness plays no role in that.